Welcome to Boston University's Occupational Therapy webinar series hosted by Pi Theta Epsilon. We are so glad you could join us. This webinar series is designed to discuss new and emerging practice areas in the field of occupational therapy. This is the third of 4 webinars that will be held this semester. Our next webinar will be held on April 24th regarding OT in hospice and using sensory approaches in mental health. You can access all past webinars on our website, which is bostonuniversitypte.weebly.com. Today's webinar is presented by Lynn Stoller on the topic of sensory-enhanced yoga. For our audience, please type in your questions throughout the presentation via the panel on the right-hand side of our screen. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session where we will ask some of the questions to the presenter. Feel free to send in questions at any time, and they will be saved for the question period of the presentation. Lynn is an occupational therapist, certified yoga therapist, and the founding president of Sensory Enhanced Yoga Institute. She has trained health professionals and yoga instructors in sensory-based yoga techniques for combat stress and PTSD since 2008, and is a former leading faculty member of 2 pioneering veteran military yoga organizations. Now we welcome Lynn to begin her presentation.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I feel very honored to have this opportunity to speak with you today on how we can effectively address core symptoms of PTSD by combining sensory-based and mindfulness-based treatment approaches, such as through sensory-enhanced yoga. Since I have limited time, I'm going to focus my talk on the relevance of trauma for OTs, and then we'll look at PTSD as a trauma-related sensory processing disorder. I will share with you the results of a small pilot study I conducted on the sensory profiles of combat veterans, following which I'll discuss the Iraq yoga study and also give you a very brief introduction to the transdisciplinary model for post-traumatic growth, which underlies the Sensory Enhanced Yoga program and was originally developed to explain the results of the Iraq yoga study. I'll save 5 to 10 minutes at the end for answering any questions that you may have. Though we have records of warriors experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress since ancient times, it wasn't until 2008 that the American Psychiatric Association created the official diagnosis of PTSD. And they did so in response to the problems seen in thousands upon thousands of Vietnam veterans. And here we are again, as the next generation of warriors returns home with similar mental health issues. In a study of more than 13,000 U.S. Army combat soldiers recently returned from Iraq, 21 to 31% were estimated to have PTSD. 8.5 to 14% of the total group surveyed reported severe functional impairment, and 23 to 31% reported some functional impairment, thus making the issue of combat stress and PTSD one of high relevance to the occupational therapy profession. Astoundingly, 39% of male combat veterans experience PTSD at some point during their lifetime, representing 5.5 times the risk found in the general population. And we don't yet have the numbers for females, as they more recently have engaged in combat operations, but we do know they are at a higher risk for military sexual trauma. The risk of suicide is 21% greater in veterans than in the adult civilian population. And the very sad fact is that 20 veterans commit suicide each day. PTSD is not limited to veterans. According to PTSDunited.org, an estimated 8% of Americans, which is equal to the total population of Texas, have PTSD at any given time, arising from a number of causes. Just consider the year 2017 with the devastation from hurricanes and floods, the gun massacre in Las Vegas, California wildfires, and it's easy to see that the topic of PTSD is as relevant as ever. 2018 isn't turning out any better with the Parkland school shooting and 16 other school shootings across the country that have occurred since January. And while all of these catastrophes are going on publicly in the media, every 98 seconds, another woman is getting raped. Rape is a trauma that has traditionally been suffered alone and in silence and without the support of one's community. But fortunately, the #MeToo movement is making great strides in bringing sexual trauma out of the shadows. Approximately 20% of the people who have experienced one or more of these traumas will go on to develop PTSD. There are 4 clusters of symptoms that define PTSD according to the current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. These are re-experiencing the event in various forms such as flashbacks, distressing dreams, and/or intrusive thoughts, images, or perceptions. Avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma, such as places, people, activities, conversations, thoughts, feelings. It really could be anything. Symptoms of numbing, such as feeling detached from others and showing a flat affect. Numbing symptoms are signs of dissociation, which is a perceived detachment from one's emotional state or even from the body. We largely identify our emotions from the effects they have on our bodies, such as butterflies in the stomach or heaviness of heart. There are numerous bodily metaphors to describe our emotional state, such as shouldering the burden, pain in the neck. It gives me goosebumps. My heart was pounding. I sweated it out. It was a very tense moment. And there are lots of analogies describing the body as an emotional container, such as I was filled with anger or I couldn't contain my joy. As you can see from these metaphors, we sense our emotions through many bodily organs and systems. So in order to detach from our negative emotions, we, by necessity, have to detach from sensations arising from our bodies. And in the process, we also detach from joy. The 4th symptom cluster of PTSD is hyperarousal, which can be expressed as sleep problems, concentration difficulties, irritability or outbursts of anger, hypervigilance, and/or exaggerated startle reflex. Many consider hyperarousal to be the core symptom of PTSD. As the trauma expert and social worker Babette Rothschild explains, hyperarousal both sets off flashbacks and is also increased by them, and it's the underlying cause of the symptom of avoidance. According to Doctors Newport and Nemiroff and many other trauma experts, disturbances in sensory processing are believed to play a prominent role in the hyperarousal symptoms of PTSD. The reverse is also true. According to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, the extreme hyperarousal that is often experienced during a traumatic event can disrupt how the event is processed in the brain, resulting in memories that present as highly fragmented sensory impressions that are often as vivid as the moment the actual event occurred. He further suggests that these sensory elements often fail to integrate together into a cohesive narrative story that can be verbally expressed, which explains why talk therapies have had only limited success. Following the trauma, those who go on to develop PTSD often show difficulties with sensory filtering, that is, the ability of the brain to sort relevant from irrelevant information. While hyperarousal and sensory filtering issues have long been known to go hand in hand, a recent study by Lorraine Stewart and Dr. Patricia White showed evidence that re-experiencing and numbing symptoms are also associated with disruption in sensory filtering. Impaired sensory processing during and following trauma highly implicates the thalamus, a brain structure critical for sensory filtering and higher level brain processing. Several years ago, I learned about the sensory symptoms of combat veterans who were attending Lucy Samini's Veterans Yoga class and was granted permission to conduct a pilot study. 12 older combat veterans who were all officially diagnosed with PTSD filled out the adolescent adult sensory profile along with the custom cover sheet, which provided space for optional comments. This slide provides a visual as to where the scores fell for the 12 veterans in each of the 12 quadrants and graphically demonstrates the striking similarity of the sensory profiles of this group. The outside edges of the quadrants represent the extreme ranges of that particular characteristic. This group scored significantly higher in sensory sensitivity, sensory avoiding, and low registration, and significantly lower in sensory seeking than the normative population at the 0.001 level of significance, which is the highest level of significance in statistics. Sensory sensitivity means a person notices sensory stimuli more than others, becomes distractible, and/or feels discomfort with sensory stimuli. Examples of sensory sensitivity that this group of veterans experienced include becoming dizzy easily, fear of heights, fear of movement, sensitivity to background noise, and startling easily. Sensation avoiding describes the degree to which the person takes action to reduce or prevent exposure to particular sensory stimuli. The group scored very high in this area as well, especially with regard to staying away from crowds and noisy settings and keeping shades down at home. Sensation seeking is the degree to which the person seeks out sensory stimuli, such as movement, dancing, running, music events, spicy foods, colorful clothing, and touch input. This group scored significantly lower in sensation seeking as compared to the norms. Finally, low registration refers to the degree to which the person misses sensory input that others notice. With regard to this pilot study, they reported decreased body awareness and sensation, such as frequently tripping and bumping into things and not knowing how they got bruises. In fact, combat veterans in the yoga classes sometimes say they can't even feel their feet or have to look to see how their limbs are positioned. Language processing issues were revealed by such items as having trouble following what people are saying when they talk fast and asking people to repeat things. According to polyvagal theory, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, auditory sensitivity goes hand in hand with language processing difficulties. Porges explains that we have evolved the capability to contract the middle ear muscles in order to process language. When we don't contract those muscles, we have a better capability of picking up sounds associated with threat, but at the expense of language processing. Though this was a very small study, PTSD was associated with the same sensory profile pattern in a larger study conducted in 2013 by Dr. Badia Ingel-Jaeger and her colleagues. And the same pattern was also revealed by the Iraq Yoga study and correlated positively with both state and trait anxiety. I'm wondering if this pattern actually reflects disruption of the salience network of the brain that has been shown to occur in both anxiety and PTSD, and I think it would be a good area for research. The adolescent adult sensory profile of one of the 12 combat veterans who scored at the extreme end ranges of the pattern described includes his only optional written comment: "I endure most of life." The hyperarousal and associated sensory processing difficulties frequently contribute to the increased irritation, frustration, and anger that many veterans with PTSD experience, which can seriously affect personal relationships and work performance. So what can we do about this problem? Well, we now have evidence that a sensory-enhanced yoga program can reduce symptoms of combat stress, which raises the question of whether it may also preempt the development of PTSD. The study took place in October 2009 on the former US Air Base in the oil-rich city of Kirkuk, Iraq. At the time of the study, the base received occasional mortar fire and the troops were living under continual threat. Within this backdrop, Air Force Major John Gruhl was teaching yoga to his comrades during his off-duty hours as a flight instructor in an effort to help everyone stay self-regulated. The Iraq yoga study is his brainstorm and is a huge accomplishment on his part. For the sake of time, I'm going to provide only the most essential details of the study, but I encourage you to read the study article in the January 2012 issue of the American Journal of Occupational Therapy. The Iraq yoga study, of which I was the associate investigator, was a randomized controlled trial of 70 active duty military personnel deployed to Kirkuk. 35 were assigned to the yoga treatment group, and 35 were assigned to the control group and received no yoga. The study was officially approved by the Institutional Review Board of the Brooke Army Medical Center. The treatment subjects were asked to attend a minimum of 9 sessions within a 3-week period. 25 met or surpassed the requirement. In fact, many surpassed it because they found it very helpful to them. And we included all subjects in the data analysis. The principal investigator, Major John Gruhl, is a certified yoga teacher and taught the yoga classes. Lucy Samini, founder of Yoga Warriors, and I co-developed the yoga treatment protocol, which was inspired by Lucy's experience in teaching combat veterans and by sensory integrative and sensory motor treatment approaches for autonomic nervous system dysfunction, which I incorporated into the program in my role as OT consultant and research coordinator for the Yoga Warriors program at the time. It was designed to provide a therapeutic threshold of enhanced proprioceptive, that is muscle input, deep touch pressure, some slow rhythmic movement, carefully selected breathing techniques that promote calming, and a series of postures to balance the nervous system. The techniques that provide inhibitory sensory input can actually be found in a variety of styles of yoga, but were chosen and combined in a manner to enhance the innate power of yoga for healing. The protocol also incorporated top-down elements. Specifically, each session had to include 2 to 5 positive affirmations per session, and at least 50% of the sessions needed to include an inspirational reading. The study tools we used were the Adolescent Adult Sensory Profile, the State Trait Anxiety Inventory, and the Quality of Life Survey, which was a custom tool developed by the survey team, by the study team. The results of the study have been rearranged here under the 4 symptom classes of PTSD. We found that the sensory-enhanced yoga was successful in reducing both state and trait anxiety at the 0.001 level of significance, despite normal pre-test scores. As you can see, the treatment group showed a significant reduction in symptoms of hyperarousal, avoidance, and numbing, and also in re-experiencing. On the optional written comments, 54% reported sleep improvements, and in fact, the general who came to talk with Major Gruhl while the study was underway was most impressed with the sleep comments, as so many of the soldiers were on prescription medications for sleeping difficulties. 37% reported that they felt more calm or relaxed. 26% reported other physical benefits, and 11% reported reduced frustration or anger or better anger management. We believe that the sensory enhanced elements of the protocol, along with the breath work, produced an inhibitory effect on the autonomic nervous system, which was our intent, and may have also led to improvements in health and quality of life indicators. The top-down elements may have reframed negative thinking patterns and helped to orient the participants to the present moment versus replaying the past or worrying about the future. Combining these top-down and bottom-up approaches together may have been the most critical feature. So I believe the implications for this study can best be explained within the context of this chart, which I developed several years ago, recently renamed a transdisciplinary model for post-traumatic growth, after I realized I had pretty much just reinvented the kosha model, an ancient yogic theory depicting humans as consisting of 5 different layers, which you can actually read above the chart. According to this theory, we have physical energy, which includes the breath, mental/emotional, wisdom, and bliss layers. The kosha model has survived for thousands of years, while the model I created was directly built from evidence from the fields of trauma psychology, occupational therapy, and neurobiology. By showing you the kosha language above the chart, I hope to impress upon you that Western science is quickly validating a lot of what the ancient yogis have theorized all along. So I will end my talk by briefly summarizing this model for you. To promote healing in PTSD, we need to help the individual safely reconnect to the body, otherwise known as the Annamaya kosha. And to do that, we need to help the person self-regulate via the Pranamaya kosha. We can do this pretty effectively through the use of carefully selected sensory input and breathing techniques designed to rebalance the autonomic nervous system, as described earlier, as well as by helping them to release trauma-based muscular tension. These techniques must be provided within a safe container, which means attending to the environmental qualities of the setting, as well as the interpersonal relationship between the therapist and client. And it also means being very careful in the way we present these techniques, and we do abide by the principles also used in the Trauma Center program, whereby we think it's important to use invitational language and provide choices. By safely increasing awareness and tolerance of bodily sensation and movement, one begins to safely reconnect bodily sensation and emotion at the level of the Manomaya kosha, that is the mental emotional body. This helps to develop the emotional and mental flexibility to more effectively adapt to social and environmental demands. Focusing on and integrating sensation, movement, and breath in present moment awareness promotes an embodied state of being, free from worries over the future and ruminations over past events. The more time spent in the here and now, the better one can mindfully attend to daily living tasks, and the more value these tasks will hold for the individual. Through this process, the mind becomes more open to new perspectives at the level of the Vijnanamaya kosha, or wisdom body. New beliefs and attitudes more easily take hold when we first prepare the body to receive and accept them. It's hard for the body-mind to take in a pep talk if it's slouched over or full of tension. Talk therapies may thus be more effective when paired with yoga, and combining top-down and bottom-up approaches within yoga, such as through sensory enhanced yoga, can be especially therapeutic. Reframing negative thinking patterns into a more positive outlook helps to promote a sense of self-empowerment, which is associated with the bliss body, or Anandamaya kosha. It is by working through the other layers that we achieve an optimal sense of well-being and an optimal sense of well-doing, as the two go hand in hand. This can be further promoted through a variety of purposeful activities congruent with personal interests and valued goals. Through this process, one develops the neurophysiological readiness and the intrinsic motivation to address the skills and habits necessary to meet daily living needs and achieve personal life goals. Finally, returning the traumatized individual back home from war or some other horror show and back into a fully engaged life in society. So that's the model, and I'm going to show you some of the references here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lynn, for your wonderful presentation on sensory enhanced yoga. We will now be reading some questions sent in by our viewers. So the first question we have is, when you talked about sensory profiles of individuals with PTSD, you mentioned that PTSD tends to correlate with altered sensations, such as the inability to feel a limb. Do you happen to know some of the neurological explanations for this, or does it have to do with being in a dissociative mental state?
Yes, that's what I would say, is that I think it associates more with a common tendency to dissociate, to numb out those feelings that I talked about before. And
Okay.
also, I think it's part of the salience network too. I think the whole nervous system just reorganizes itself to be on the lookout for threats. So, you know, sensations within the body may not be as critical to someone, but that does depend on the type of war environment that the person fought in. For example, Hunt and colleagues have found that they've observed that soldiers who fought in the Gulf Wars, where chemical exposure was common, were more often triggered by and hypervigilant towards those internal somatosensory cues, whereas soldiers in the Vietnam War and the recent wars are more observant of external cues, such as a car that might be carrying a bomb or something like that. So I think the nervous system just gets reorganized to the most important salient information, and it tunes out some of the other information.
Great, thank you. The second question we have is it possible that the sensory profiles you observed among veterans with PTSD can also be explained by the fact that individuals who enter the military might have a similar sensory profile, rather than the other way around, that concluding that the sensory profiles are a cause of experience to combat?
Well, I do think that the military does drill in the whole battle mind, and I definitely do agree that this is a possibility, and it's certainly worth investigating.
Great, and then we just have one more question from our audience. And Lynn, you may or may not be able to explain this in the specific curriculum, but can you explain more about the important sensory enhancements in this approach that differ from other yoga practices we might already be familiar with?
Yes, there are actually a variety of, well, there's tons of different yoga styles. And it seems to me that certain styles have picked up on certain, they've noticed certain things. They've picked up on certain types of sensory input that make their style effective. There are, for example, the Vini yoga style tends to have a lot of slow rhythmic movements, but they don't mention really that vestibular aspect to it. But if you look at some of their literature, you can kind of pick out which ones actually provide vestibular movement versus ones that don't. Like, so you can have rhythmic movement, but of course it doesn't provide vestibular input unless your head is also moving. And so some of those techniques don't do that, but they do tend to have a lot more of that slow rhythmic movement, whereas other types of styles such as Iyengar tend to be more static yoga poses, and they also use a lot more props, and there's a lot more opportunity to provide some deep touch input or things like that, more weight bearing. And there's some restorative poses too as well that provides a lot of additional input. And there's just certain other techniques that we include into the program. And we just, the whole point of it is that we try to do this in a very scientific way in terms of trying to increase the threshold of sensory input, of therapeutic sensory input. And it's not just about adding sensory input, it's really about modulating sensory input as well. We want to avoid certain types of sensory input as well. There are a lot of yoga styles that are actually very excitatory to the nervous system, and there are a lot of breathing techniques that also are very excitatory to the nervous system, and we avoid those techniques. And what we really want is to create a balance in the nervous system.
Great, thank you. We have one more question. Do you see sensory enhanced yoga being applied or useful to populations beyond veterans?
Oh, absolutely.
Children who have experienced trauma?
Absolutely. It's funny you mentioned that. One of the reasons why I developed I started the Sensory Enhanced Yoga Institute was because it really is applicable to all sorts of types of trauma. And we have experts on our faculty who specialize in working with people who have been sexually traumatized, who have been traumatized through various reasons and ended up in jail. It's just a lot of different types of populations. So, and the other thing is with regard to children, we're starting a new program called the SMILE program, Sensory and Mindfulness-Based Yoga for Learning Environments. And that's going to be rolled out this coming spring. I mean, not this spring, next spring. And it's in the preparation stages right now. And that will specifically relate to working with children. In fact, it's interesting because I first used yoga in my OT caseload with, especially with adolescents and young adults within a school system. So it's sort of coming for full circle back around to that population as well. But that will be a separate program within the Sensory Enhanced Yoga Institute. So there'll be an adult program and one specifically for pediatrics, which needs to be modified in terms of, the developmental level and language processing, that sort of thing.
Right. Well, great. Thank you again to Lynn for speaking with us today, and thank you all for listening. We hope you will join us again on Tuesday, April 24th for our final webinar. Thank
you very much. It was a pleasure to speak with you. Again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to contact me I have my email address on the screen. And if you're inspired and feel like joining us at a workshop, I invite you to sign up for one of the ones that are coming up. We have one coming up in May in Rhode Island. And I also have a book, by the way, coming up it's supposed to be released in the fall of this year. So,
great. Thank you very much, Lynn.
You're very welcome. Thank you.